We will continue talking about arrays. We learn how to declare an array and how to populate the array, and also how to call or access the contents of the array. So if you remember, we said to define, and this is just a quick review, to define an array, we said the first thing we need to do is to define the data type used. So here, for example, it says double. And then to specify that this is an array, we use the square brackets, and then we call or give it a reference variable. And then we use the new keyword, again, the data type, and then we specify the length of that array. Now, one thing we need to think about here or to remember is that this is an object. This format of defining something, it looks like an object. So that's why an array is an object. So in this case, the length of this array is 25. All right, and then we said the one thing that is that this 25 here doesn't have to be hard-coded. It could be a variable that was defined before and was assigned a value, and then you can use that variable here. It could be another variable that gets populated by prompting the user for an input. So it's really flexible here how you define the length of the array. However, remember that you have to declare it, you have to define it, all right, one way or another. And also, once you define it, it's final. Now, one thing that you need to learn about this is that later on, if you want to access the length of the array, you could actually access it using the reference variable dot length. All right. So if I say int size is equal to temperatures dot length, that is going to return an integer that will be stored in size, and that is going to be the length, which is 25. So that is a very nice way to access. So you don't have to hard code the values, right? So for example, you define, let's say, an array of 7 days to get the temperatures and calculate the average. I think we had this example before. So later on, you decide to expand this code and make it work for 30 days. Now you don't have to go throughout the whole code and try to change every single 7 to 25 to 30. Just to make it work. So in this case, you could build the function or the methods or the loops in a way that is actually flexible to access the length of the array. So one thing here that I'm going to note, and I'm going to remind you later in 1 or 2 lectures, is that notice here that this length doesn't have empty parentheses. And you need to ask yourself, what does that mean? All right. Remember that we had, if I say string, name is equal to CS 1440, for example, and then I go and say name dot length, right? So that is something which is completely different from this one. What's the difference? With the curly with the parentheses, that makes it a method, right? Now, if we don't have parentheses, that doesn't make it a method, and if it's not a method, it has to be a field. All right, so this is something to remember. I will remind you of this in the next lecture probably. All right, so here that you know how to access the length, then you can always work with it in terms of like defining the loops or something. You can actually use, as we said, temperatures.length instead of hard coding this value to 25. The one thing about this is that you need to always remember checking the boundaries for the array, right? It has to be one value less than the length, right? So it's either you should do it like less than, or it's less than or equal the temperatures dot length minus 1. So either this or that, both of them are equivalent in this case. So this is something to remember. The last thing is something I mentioned, is that you could actually prompt the user. So here, for example, I could declare an array that is of type integer. It's called tests. And then what will happen later on is that I will prompt the user, how many tests do you want to enter? And in that case, you could take that input and then use it to actually assign the actual array. Now notice here that these two are 2 stages. The first one builds the reference variable tests, right, which has pointing to null at the beginning. Then later on, you say no, it's not pointing to null anymore. It's going to point to an actual array in the memory that has the length that goes from 0, indexed from 0 to num tests minus 1. So that's exactly what happens when you do this. All right, so the last thing, so this is the first video. Before we go, I'm going to show you this code quickly. So something like this, I have days and I assign days here, and I have no idea, I didn't count this, I don't know how many days we have here. However, I could go, and I'm going to comment these and this one here, and then I could go and say system.out.println, and say, for example, here days.length. All right, so here, and remember, this was a way to actually declare an array by hard coding the values in it, and that is useful if you have something countable and something easy to list in this way. So if I do this, then we have 12 elements, right? We have 12 elements: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So from 0 to 11, that's 12 elements. So days.length, I could use that. I could also do something like this. For int I is equal to 0, I is less than days dot length I plus plus, and then I'm going to print system.out.println, and I'm going to say, for example, here days of or sub I, right, with a space afterwards. All right, so here compile, and actually let's do it print, so this way in a single line here. There we go. So this is my array going from 31, 28, 31, and so on. All right, so that's how to use the days.length or the length field of arrays. It's not a method, it's a field.